The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley.
Hello everyone and welcome to the program. I'm Matthew Handley. We are nearing the end of our story in today's episode, and both segments will be readings from the novel Death Comes for the Archbishop. In the first half of the program, we say goodbye to Father Joseph Vaillant, who is called to Colorado to minister to the influx of miners amidst the gold rush. Then in the second half of the program, Bishop Jean-Marie Latour enters his retirement and begins to reflect back on the life that he has lived.
Chapter 2, A Letter from Leavenworth.
The day after the bishop and his vicar rode to the Yellow Rock, the weekly post arrived in Santa Fe. It brought the bishop many letters, and he was shut in his study all morning. At lunch, he told Father Vaillant that he would require his company that evening to consider with him a letter of great importance from the Bishop of Leavenworth. This letter, of many pages, was concerned with events that were happening in Colorado, in a part of the Rocky Mountains very little known. Though it was only a few hundred miles north of Santa Fe, communication with that region was so infrequent that news traveled to Santa Fe from Europe more quickly than from Pike's Peak. Under the shadow of that peak, rich gold deposits had been discovered within the last year, but Father Vaillant had first heard of this through a letter from France. Word of it had reached the Atlantic coast, crossed to Europe, and come back there to the southwest, more quickly than it could filter down through the few hundred miles of unexplored mountains and gorges between Cripple Creek and Santa Fe. While Father Vaillant was at Tucson, he had received a letter from his brother Marius in Auvergne, and was vexed that so much of it was taken up with inquiries about the gold rush to Colorado, of which he had never heard, while Marius gave him but little news of the war in Italy, which seemed relatively near and much more important. That congested heaping up of the Rocky Mountains chain about Pike's Peak was a blank space on the continent at this time. Even the fur trappers coming down from Wyoming to Taos with their pelts avoided that humped granite backbone. Only a few years before, Fremont had tried to penetrate the Colorado Rockies, and his party had come half-starved into Taos at last, having eaten most of their horses. But within 12 months, everything had changed. Wandering prospectors had found large deposits of gold near Cripple Creek, and the mountains that were solitary a year ago were now full of people. Wagon trains were streaming westward across the prairies from the Missouri River. The Bishop of Leavenworth wrote Father Latour that he himself had just returned from a visit to Cripple Creek. He had found the slopes under Pike's Peak dotted with camps, the gorges black with placer miners. Thousands of people were living in tents and shacks. Cherry Creek was full of saloons and gambling rooms, and among all the wanderers and wastrels were many honest men, hundreds of good Catholics, and not one priest. The young men were adrift in a loveless society without spiritual guidance. The old men died from exposure and mountain pneumonia, with no one to give them the last rites of the church. This new and populous community must, for the present, the Kansas bishop wrote, be accounted under Father Latour's jurisdiction. His great diocese, already enlarged by thousands of square miles to the south and west, must now, on the north, take in the still undefined but suddenly important region of the Colorado Rockies. The Bishop of Leavenworth begged him to send a priest there as soon as possible, an able one by all means, not only devoted, but resourceful and intelligent, one who would be at ease with all sorts of men. He must take his bedding and camp outfit, medicines and provisions, and clothing for the severe winter. At Camp Denver, there was nothing to be bought but tobacco and whiskey. There were no women there, and no cook stoves. The miners lived on half-baked dough and alcohol. They did not even keep the mountain water pure, and so died of fever. All the living conditions were abominable. In the evening after dinner, Father Latour read this letter aloud to Father Vaillant in his study. When he had finished, he put down the closely written pages. You have been complaining of inactivity, Father Joseph. Here's your opportunity. Father Joseph, who had been growing more and more restless during the reading of the letter, said merely, "So now I must begin speaking English again. I could start tomorrow if you wish." The bishop shook his head. "Not so fast. There will be no hospitable Mexicans to receive you at the end of this journey. You must take your living with you. We will have a wagon built for you and choose your outfit carefully. Tranquilino's brother, Sabino, will be your driver. This, I fear, will be the hardest mission you've ever undertaken." The two priests talked until the late hour. There was Arizona to be considered. Someone must be found to continue Father Vaillant's work there. Of all the countries he knew, that desert and its yellow people were the dearest to him. But it was the discipline of his life to break ties, to say farewell, and move on into the unknown. Before he went to bed that night, Father Joseph greased his boots and trimmed the callous spots on his feet with an old razor. At the Mexican village of Chimayo, toward the Truchas Mountains, the good people were especially devoted to a little equestrian image of Santiago in their church, and they made him a new pair of boots every few months, insisting that he went abroad at night and wore out his shoes, even on horseback. When Father Joseph stayed there, he used to tell them he wished that, in addition to the consecration of hands, God had provided some special blessing for the missionaries' feet. He recalled affectionately an incident which concerned this Santiago of Chimayo. Some years ago, Father Joseph was asked to go to the calabozo at Santa Fe to see a murderer from Chimayo. The prisoner proved to be a boy of 20, very gentle in face and manner. His name was Ramon Armajillo. He had been passionately fond of cockfighting, and it was his undoing. He had bred a rooster that never lost a battle, but had slit the necks of cocks in all the little towns about. At last Ramon brought the bird to Santa Fe to match him with a famous cock there, and half a dozen Chimayo boys came along to put up everything they had on Ramon's rooster. The betting was heavy on both sides, and the gate receipts were also to go to the winner. After a somewhat doubtful beginning, Ramon's cock neatly ripped the jugular vein of his opponent, but the owner of the defeated bird, before anyone could stop him, reached into the ring and wrung the victor's neck. Before he had dropped the limp bunch of feathers from his hand, Ramon's knife was in his heart. It all happened in a flash. Some of the witnesses even insisted that the death of the man and the death of the cock were simultaneous. All agreed that there was not time for a man to catch his breath between the whirl of the wrist and the gleam of the knife. Unfortunately, the American judge was a very stupid man who disliked Mexicans and hoped to wipe out cockfighting. He accepted as evidence statements made by the murdered man's friends to the effect that Ramon had repeatedly threatened his life. When Father Vaillant went to see the boy in his cell a few days before his execution, he found him making a pair of tiny buckskin boots, as if for a doll, and Ramon told him they were for the little Santiago in the church at home. His family would come up to Santa Fe for the hanging, and they would take the boots back to Chimayo, and perhaps the little saint would say a good word for him. Rubbing oil into his boots by candlelight, Father Vaillant sighed. The criminals with whom he would have to do in Colorado would hardly be of that type, he told himself.
Chapter 3, Auspis Maria.
The construction of Father Vaillant's wagon took a month. It must be a wagon of very unusual design, capable of carrying a great deal, yet light enough and narrow enough to wind through the mountain gorges beyond Pueblo, where there were no roads at all, except the rocky ravines cut out by streams that flowed full in the spring, but would be dry now in the autumn. While his wagon was building, Father Joseph was carefully selecting his stores, and the furnishings for a small chapel which he meant to construct of saplings or canvas immediately upon his arrival at Camp Denver. Moreover, there were his valises full of medals, crosses, rosaries, colored pictures, and religious pamphlets. For him he required no books but his breviary and the ordinary of the Mass. In the bishop's courtyard he sorted and resorted his cargo, always finding a more necessary article for which a less necessary had to be discarded. Fructosa and Magdalena were frequently called upon to help him, and when a box was finally closed, Fructosa had put it away in the woodshed. She had noticed the bishop's brows contract slightly when he came upon these trunks and chests in his hallway and dining room. All the bedding and clothing was packed in great sacks of dressed calfskin, which Sabino procured from old Mexican settlers. These were already going out of fashion, but in the early days they were the poor man's trunk. Bishop Latour also was very busy at this time, training a new priest from Clermont, riding about with him among the distant parishes and trying to give him an understanding of the people. As a bishop, he could only approve of Father Vaillant's eagerness to be gone and the enthusiasm with which he turned to hardships of a new kind. But as a man, he was a little hurt that his old comrade should leave him without one regret. He seemed to know, as if it had been revealed to him, that this was a final break, that their lives would part here, and that they would never work together again. The bustle of preparation in his own house was painful to him, and he was glad to be abroad among the parishes. One day, when the bishop had returned from Albuquerque, Father Vaillant came in to luncheon in high spirits. He had been out for a drive on his new wagon and declared that it was satisfactory at last. Sabino was ready, and he thought that they would start the day after tomorrow. He diagrammed his route on the tablecloth and went over the catalogue of his equipment. The bishop was tired and scarcely touched his food, but Father Joseph ate generously, as he was apt to do when fired by a new project. After Fructosa had brought the coffee, he leaned back in his chair and turned to his friend with a beaming face. "I often think, Jean, how you were an unconscious agent in the hands of Providence when you recalled me from Tucson. I seemed to be doing the most important work of my life there, and you recalled me for no reason at all, apparently. You did not know why, and I did not know why. We were both acting in the dark, but heaven knew what was happening at Cripple Creek, and moved us like chessmen on the board. When the call came, I was here to answer it, by a miracle, indeed." Father Latour put down his silver coffee cup. "Miracles are all very well, Joseph, but I see none here. I sent for you because I felt the need of your companionship. I used my authority as bishop to gratify my personal wish. That was selfish, if you will, but surely natural enough. We are countrymen, and we are bound by early memories. And that two friends, having come together, should part and go their separate ways, that is natural too. No, I don't think we need any miracle to explain all this." Father Vaillant had been wholly absorbed in his preparations for saving souls in the gold camps, blind to everything else. Now it came over him in a flash, how the bishop had held himself aloof from his activities. It was a very hard thing for Father Latour to let him go. The loneliness of his position had begun to weigh upon him. Yes, he reflected as he went quietly to his own room, there was a great difference in their natures. Wherever he went, he soon made friends that took the place of country and family. But Jean, who was at ease in any society and always the flower of courtesy, could not form new ties. It had always been so. He was like that even as a boy, gracious to everyone, but known to a very few. To a man's wisdom, it would have seemed that a priest with Father Latour's exceptional qualities would have been better placed in some part of the world where scholarship, a handsome person, and delicate perceptions all have their effect, and that a man of much rougher type would have served God well enough to be the first bishop of New Mexico. Doubtless, Bishop Latour's successors would be men of a different fiber, but God had his reasons, Father Joseph devoutly believed. Perhaps it pleased him to grace the beginning of a new era and a vast new diocese by a fine personality, and perhaps, after all, something would remain through the years to come, some ideal or memory or legend. The next afternoon, his wagon loaded and standing ready in the courtyard, Father Vaillant was seated at the bishop's desk, writing letters to France, a short one to Marius, a long one to his beloved Philomene, telling her of his plunge into the unknown and begging her prayers for his success in the world of gold-crazed men. He wrote rapidly and jerkily, moving his lips as well as his fingers. When the bishop entered the study, he rose and stood holding the written pages in his hand. "I did not mean to interrupt you, Joseph, but do you intend to take Contento with you to Colorado?" Father Joseph blinked. "Why, certainly I had intended to ride him. However, if you have need for him here—" "Oh, no, not at all. But if you take Contento, I ask you take Angelica as well. They have great affection for each other. Why separate them indefinitely? One could not explain to them. They've worked long together." Father Vaillant made no reply. He stood looking intently at the pages of his letter. The bishop saw a drop of water splash down upon the violet script and spread. He turned quickly and went out through the arched doorway. At sunrise next morning, Father Vaillant set out, Sabino driving the wagon, his oldest boy riding Angelica, and Father Joseph himself riding Contento. They took the old road to the northeast, through the sharp red sand hills spotted with juniper, and the bishop accompanied them as far as the loop where the road wound out on the top of one of those conical hills, giving the departing traveler his last glimpse of Santa Fe. There Father Joseph drew rein and looked back at the town lying rosy in the morning light, the mountain behind it, and the hills close about it like two encircling arms. Auspice Maria, he murmured as he turned his back on these familiar things. The bishop rode home to his solitude. He was 47 years old, and he had been a missionary in the New World for 20 years, 10 of them in New Mexico. If he were a parish priest at home, there would be nephews coming to him for help in their Latin, or a bit of pocket money, nieces to run into his garden and bring their sewing and keep an eye on his housekeeping. All the way home he indulged in such reflections as any bachelor nearing 50 might have. But when he entered his study, he seemed to come back to reality, to the sense of a presence awaiting him. The curtain of the arched doorway had scarcely fallen behind him when that feeling of personal loneliness was gone, and a sense of loss was replaced by a sense of restoration. He sat down before his desk, deep in reflection. It was just this solitariness of love which a priest's life could be like his master's. It was not a solitude of atrophy, of negation, but of perpetual flowering. A life need not be cold or devoid of grace in the worldly sense, if it were filled by her who was all the graces, Virgin Daughter, Virgin Mother, Girl of the people, and Queen of Heaven, le rêve suprême de la chair. The nursery tale could not vie with her in simplicity. The wisest theologians could not match her in her profundity. Here in his own church in Santa Fe, there was one of these nursery virgins, a little wooden figure, very old and very dear to the people. De Vargas, when he recaptured the city for Spain 200 years ago, had vowed a yearly procession in her honor, and it was still one of the most solemn events in the Christian year in Santa Fe. She was a little wooden figure, about 3 feet high, very stately in bearing, with a beautiful, though rather severe, Spanish face. She had a rich wardrobe, a chest full of robes and laces and gold and silver diadems. The women loved to sew for her, and the silversmiths to make her chains and brooches. Father Latour had delighted her wardrobe keepers when he told them he did not believe the Queen of England or the Empress of France had so many costumes. She was their doll and their queen, something to fondle and something to adore, as Mary's son must have been to her. These poor Mexicans, he reflected, were not the first to pour out their love in the simple fashion. Raphael and Titian made costumes for her in their time, and the great masters had made music for her, and the great architects had built cathedrals for her. Long before her years on earth, in the long twilight between the fall and the redemption, the pagan sculptors were always trying to achieve the image of a goddess who should yet be a woman. Bishop Latour's premonition was right. Father Vaillant never returned to share his work in New Mexico. Come back he did to visit his old friends whenever his busy life permitted, but his destiny was fulfilled in the cold, steely Colorado Rockies, which he never loved as he did the Blue Mountains of the South. He came back to Santa Fe to recuperate from the illness and accidents which constantly punctuated his way, came with the papal emissary when Bishop Latour was made archbishop, but his working life was spent among the bleak mountains in comfortless mining camps, looking after lost sheep. Creede, Durango, Silver City, Central City, over the Continental Divide into Utah, his strange episcopal carriage was known throughout the rugged granite world. It was a covered carriage on springs and long enough for him to lie down at night. Father Joseph was a very short man. At the back was a luggage box, which would be made into an altar when he celebrated Mass in the open, under a pine tree. He used to say that the mountain torrents were the first road builders, and that wherever they found a way, he could find one. He wore out driver after driver, and his coach was repaired so often and so extensively that long before he abandoned it, there was not one of the original structure left. Broken tongues and singletrees, smashed wheels and splintered axles he considered trifling matters. Twice, the old carriage itself slipped off the mountain road and rolled down the gorge with the priest inside. From the first accident of this kind, Father Vaillant escaped with nothing worse than a sprain, and he wrote Bishop Latour that he attributed his preservation to the Archangel Raphael, whose office he had said with unusual fervor that morning. The second time he rolled down a ravine near Central City, his thigh bone was broken just below the joint. It knitted in time, but he was lamed for life and could never ride horseback again. Before this accident befell him, however, he had one long visit among his friends in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, a renewal of old ties that was like an Indian summer in his life. When he left Denver, he told his congregation there that he was going to the Mexicans to beg for money. The church in Denver was under a roof, but the windows had been boarded up for months because nobody would buy glass for them. In his Denver congregation, there were men who owned mines and sawmills and flourishing businesses, but they needed all their money to push these enterprises. Down among the Mexicans, who owned nothing but a mud house and a burro, he could always raise money. If they had anything at all, they gave. He called this trip, frankly, a begging expedition, and he went in his carriage to bring back whatever he could gather. When he got as far as Taos, his Irish driver mutinied. "Not another mile over these roads," he said. He knew his own territory, but he refused to risk his neck and the Padres. There was then no wagon road from Taos to Santa Fe. It was nearly a fortnight before Father Vaillant found a man who would undertake to get him through the mountains. At last, an old driver, schooled on the wagon trains, volunteered, and with the help of an axe and pick and shovel, he brought the Episcopal carriage safely to Santa Fe and into the bishop's courtyard. Once again among his own people, as he still called them, Father Joseph opened his campaign, and the poor Mexicans began taking dollars out of their shirts and boots, favorite places for carrying money, to pay for windows in the Denver church. His petitions did not stop with windows. Indeed, they only began there. He told the sympathetic women of Santa Fe and Albuquerque about all the stupid, unnecessary discomforts of his life in Denver, discomforts that amounted to improprieties. It was a part of the Wild West attitude to despise the decencies of life. He told them how glad he was to sleep in a good Mexican bed once more. In Denver, he lay on a mattress stuffed with straw. A French priest who was visiting him had pulled out a long stem of hay that stuck through the thin ticking and called it an American feather. His dining table was made of planks covered in oilcloth. He had no linen at all, neither sheets nor serviettes, and he used his worn-out shirts for face towels. The Mexican women could scarcely bear to hear of such things. Nobody in Colorado planted gardens, Father Vaillant related. No one would stick a shovel into the earth for anything less than gold. There was no butter, no milk, no eggs, no fruit. He lived on dough and cured hog meat. Within a few weeks of his arrival, 6 feather beds were sent to the bishop's house for Father Vaillant, dozens of linen sheets, embroidered pillowcases and tablecloths and napkins, strings of chili and boxes of beans and dried fruit. The little settlement of Chamayo sent a roll of their finest blankets. As these gifts arrived, Father Joseph put them in the woodhouse, knowing well that the bishop was always embarrassed by his readiness to receive presents. But one morning, Father Latour had occasion to go into the warehouse, and he saw for himself. "Father Joseph," he remonstrated, "you will never be able to take all these things back to Denver. Why, you would need an ox cart to carry them." "Very well," replied Father Joseph, "then God will send me an ox cart." And he did, with a driver to take the cart as far as Pueblo. On the morning of his departure for home, when his carriage was ready, the cart covered with tarpaulins and the oxen yoked, Father Vaillant, who had been hurrying everyone since the first streak of light, suddenly became deliberate. He went into the bishop's study and sat down, talking to him of unimportant matters, lingering as if there were something still undone. "Well, we are getting older, Jean," he said abruptly after a short silence. The bishop smiled. "Ah, yes, we are not young men anymore. One of these departures will be the last." Father Vaillant nodded. "Whenever God wills, I am ready." He rose and began to pace the floor, addressing his friend without looking at him. "But it has not been so bad, John. We have done the things we used to plan to do long ago when we were seminarians, at least some of them. To fulfill the dreams of one's youth, that is the best that can happen to a man. No worldly success can take the place of that." "Blanchet," said the bishop, rising, "you are a better man than I. You have been a great harvester of souls, without pride and without shame, and I am always a little cold. En peinant, as you used to say. If hereafter we have stars in our crowns, yours will be a constellation. Give me your blessing." He knelt, and Father Vaillant, having blessed him, knelt and was blessed in turn. They embraced each other for the past, for the future.
Support for this program comes from Hotels.com, an online travel service offering booking options for accommodations worldwide. Hotels.com provides tools to compare and book hotels, vacation rentals, and other lodging types, with a wide selection available across various destinations. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/hotels. And by Audible, an audiobook and spoken word entertainment service offering a wide selection of audiobooks, podcasts, and Audible originals, including titles such as Pope Francis's God is Young and Pope Benedict XVI's Jesus of Nazareth. More information is available at audibletrial.com/purple.
If you have missed any part of this series, all previous episodes are streaming now at purplecatholic.com. You can also find links to purchase a copy of the book to read again or follow along with the program. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Matthew Handley. Let us begin the conclusion of Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Book 9, Death Comes for the Archbishop, Chapter 1.
When that devout nun, Mother Superior Philomene, died at a great age in her native realm, among her papers were found several letters from Archbishop Latour, one dated December 1888, only a few months before his death. "Since your brother was called to his reward," he wrote, "I feel nearer to him than before. For many years duty separated us, but death has brought us together. The time is not far distant when I shall join him. Meanwhile, I am enjoying to the full that period of reflection which is the happiest conclusion to a life of action." This period of reflection the Archbishop spent on his little country estate, some 4 miles north of Santa Fe. Long before his retirement from the cares of his diocese, Father Latour bought these few acres in the Red Sandhills near the Teseque Pueblo, and set out an orchard which would be bearing when the time came for him to rest. He chose this place in the Red Hills, spotted with juniper against the advice of his friends, because he believed it to be admirably suited for the growing of fruit. Once when he was riding out to visit the Teseque mission, he had followed a stream and come upon this spot, where he found a little Mexican house and a garden shaped by an apricot tree of such great size as he had never seen before. It had 2 trunks, each of them thicker than a man's body, and though evidently very old, it was full of fruit. The apricots were large, beautifully colored, and of superb flavor. Since this tree grew against the hillside, the Archbishop concluded that the exposure there must be excellent for fruit. He surmised that the heat of the sun, reflected from the rocky hill slope up into the tree, gave the fruit an even temperature, warmth from 2 sides, such as brings the wall peaches to perfection in France. The old Mexican who lived there said the tree must be 200 years old. It had been just like this when his grandfather was a boy, and had always borne luscious apricots like these. The old man would be glad to sell the place and move into Santa Fe, the bishop found, and he bought it a few weeks later. In the spring, he set out his orchard and a few rows of acacia trees. Some years afterward, he built a little adobe house with a chapel high up on the hillside overlooking the orchard. Thither he used to go for rest and at seasons of special devotion. After his retirement, he went to live there, though he always kept his study unchanged in the house of the new archbishop. In his retirement, Father Latour's principal work was the training of new missionary priests who arrived from France. His successor, the second archbishop, was also an Auvergnat from Father Latour's own college, and the clergy of northern New Mexico remained predominantly French. When a company of new priests arrived, they never came singly, Archbishop S. sent them out to stay with Father Latour for a few months, to receive instruction in Spanish and in the topography of the diocese, as well as the character and traditions of the different pueblos. Father Latour's recreation was his garden. He grew such fruit as was hardly to be found even in the old orchards of California, cherries and apricots, apples and quiches, and peerless pears of France, even the most delicate varieties. He urged the new priests to plant fruit trees wherever they went and to encourage the Mexicans to add fruit to their starchy diet. Wherever there was a French priest, there should be a garden of fruit trees and vegetables and flowers. He often quoted to his students that passage from their fellow Auvergnat Pascal, that man was lost and saved in a garden. He domesticated and developed the native wildflowers. He had one hillside solidly clad with that low-growing purple verbena which mats over the hills of New Mexico. It was like a great violet velvet mantle thrown down in the sun, all the shades that the dryers and weavers of Italy and France strove for through the centuries, the violet that is full of rose color and is yet not lavender, the blue that becomes almost pink and then retreats again into sea dark purple, the true Episcopal colors, and countless variations of it. In the year 1885, there came to New Mexico a young seminarian, Bernard Ducrot, who became like a son to Father Latour. The story of the old archbishop's life, often told in the cloisters and classrooms at Montferrand, had taken hold of this boy's imagination, and he long waited an opportunity to come. Bernard was handsome in person and of unusual mentality. He had in himself the finesse to reverence all that was fine in his venerable superior. He anticipated Father Latour's every wish, shared his reflections, cherished his reminiscences. Surely, the bishop used to say to the priests, God himself has sent me this young man to help me through the last years.
Chapter 2.
Throughout the autumn of the year 88, the bishop was in good health. He had 5 French priests in his house, and he still rode abroad with them to visit the nearer missions. On Christmas Eve, he performed the midnight mass in the cathedral at Santa Fe. In January, he drove with Bernard to Santa Cruz to see the resident priest who is ill. While they were on their way home, the weather suddenly changed, and a violent rainstorm overtook them. They were in an open buggy and were drenched to the skin before they could reach any Mexican house for shelter. After arriving home, Father Latour went at once to bed. During the night, he slept badly and felt feverish. He called none of his household, but arose at the usual hour before dawn and went into the chapel for his devotions. While he was at prayer, he was seized with a chill. He made his way to the kitchen, and his old cook, Fructosa, alarmed at once, put him to bed and gave him brandy. This chill left him feverish, and he developed a distressing cough. After keeping quietly to his bed for a few days, the bishop called young Bernard to him one morning and said, Bernard, will you ride into Santa Fe today and see the Archbishop for me? Ask him whether it will be quite convenient if I return to occupy my study in his house for a short time. Je voudrais mourir à Santa Fe. I will go at once, Father, but you should not be discouraged. One does not die of a cold. The old man smiled. I shall not die of a cold, my son. I shall die of having lived. From that moment on, he only spoke French to those about him, and this sudden relaxing of his rule alarmed his household more than anything else about his condition. When a priest had received bad news from home or was ill, Father Latour would converse with him in his own language, but at other times he required that all conversations in his house should be in Spanish or English. Bernard returned that afternoon to say the Archbishop would be delighted if Father Latour would remain the rest of the winter with him. Magdalena had already begun to air out his study and put it in order, and she would be in special attendance upon him during his visit. The Archbishop would send his new carriage to fetch him, as Father Latour only had an open buggy. Not today, mon fils, said the bishop. We will choose a day when I am feeling stronger, a fair day when we can go in my own buggy, and you can drive me. I wish to go late in the afternoon, towards sunset. Bernard understood. He knew that once long ago at that hour of the day, a young bishop had ridden along the Albuquerque road and seen Santa Fe for the first time. And often when they were driving into town together, the bishop had paused with Bernard on that hilltop from which Father Vaillant had looked back on Santa Fe when he went away to Colorado to begin the work that had taken the rest of his life and made him, too, a bishop in the end. The old town was better to look at in those days, Father Latour used to tell Bernard with a sigh. In the old days, it had an individuality, a style of its own. A tawny adobe town with few green trees, set in a half-circle of carnelian-covered hills, that and no more. But the year 1880 had begun a period of incongruous American building. Now half the plaza square was still adobe, and half was flimsy wooden buildings with double porches, scrollwork and jackstraw posts, and banisters painted white. Father Latour said the wooden houses, which had so distressed him in Ohio, had followed him. All this was quite wrong for the cathedral he had been so many years in building, the cathedral that had taken Father Vaillant's place in his life after that remarkable man went away. Father Latour made his last entry into Santa Fe at the end of a brilliant February afternoon. Bernard stopped the horses at the foot of the long street to await the sunset. Wrapped in his Indian blankets, the old Archbishop sat for a long while, looking at the open, golden face of his cathedral. How exactly young Molny, his French architect, had done what he wanted. Nothing sensational, simply honest building and good stone cutting, good midi Romanesque of the plainest. And even now, in winter, when the acacia trees before the door were bare, how it was of the South, that church, how it sounded the note of the South. No one but Molny and the bishop had ever seemed to enjoy the beautiful sight of that building. Perhaps no one ever would. But these two had spent many an hour admiring it. The steep carnelian hills drew up so close behind the church that the individual pine trees thinly wooding their slopes were clearly visible. From the end of the street where the bishop's buggy stood, the tawny church seemed to start directly out of those rose-colored hills, with a purpose so strong that it was like action. Seen from this distance, the cathedral lay against the pine-slashed slopes as against a curtain. When Bernard drove slowly nearer, the backbone of the hills sank gradually, and the towers rose clear into the blue air, while the body of the church still lay against the mountain. The young architect used to tell the bishop that only in Italy, or in the opera, did churches leap out of mountains and black pines like that. More than once, Molny had called the bishop from his study to look at the unfinished building when a storm was coming up. Then the sky above the mountain grew black, and the carnelian rocks became an intense lavender, all their pine tree strokes of dark purple. The hills drew nearer, the whole background approached like a dark threat. Setting, Molny used to tell Father Latour, is accident. Either a building is a part of a place or it is not. Once that kinship is there, time will only make it stronger. The bishop was recalling this saying of Molny's when a voice out of the present sounded in his ear. It was Bernard. "A fine sunset, Father. See how the red mountains are growing. Sangre de Cristo." Yes, Sangre de Cristo, but no matter how scarlet the sunset, those red hills never became vermilion, but a more and more intense rose carnelian. Not the color of living blood, the bishop had often reflected, but the color of dried blood of saints and martyrs preserved in the old churches of Rome, which liquefies upon occasion.
Chapter 3.
The next morning, Father Latour wakened with a grateful sense of nearness to his cathedral, which would also be his tomb. He felt safe under its shadow, like a boat come back into harbor, lying under its own seawall. He was in his old study. The sisters had sent a little iron bed from the school for him, and their finest linen and blankets. He felt a great content at being there, where he had come as a young man, and where he had done his work. The room was little changed. The same rugs and skins on the earth floor, the same desk with its candlesticks, the same thick, wavy white walls that muted sound, that shut out the world, and gave repose to the spirit. As darkness faded into the gray of a winter morning, he listened for the church bells, and for another sound that always amused him there, the whistle of a locomotive. Yes, he had come with the buffalo, and he had lived to see the railway trains running into Santa Fe. He had accomplished an historic period. All his relatives at home and his friends in New Mexico had expected that the old archbishop would spend his closing years in France, probably in Clermont, where he would occupy a chair at his old college. That seemed the natural thing to do, and he had given it grave consideration. He had half expected to make some arrangement the last time he was in Auvergne, just before his retirement from his duties as archbishop. But in the old world he found himself homesick for the new. It was a feeling he could not explain, a feeling that old age did not weigh so heavily upon a man in New Mexico as in the Puy-de-Dôme. He loved the towering peaks of his native mountains, the comeliness of the villages, the cleanliness of the countryside, the beautiful lines and the cloisters of his own village. Clermont was beautiful, but he found himself sad there. His heart lay like a stone in his breast. There was too much past, perhaps. When the summer winds stirred the lilacs in the old gardens and shook down the blooms of the horse-chestnuts, he sometimes closed his eyes and thought of the high song the wind was singing in the straight, striped pine trees up in the Navajo forests. During the day his nostalgia wore off, and by dinner time it was quite gone. He enjoyed his dinner and his wine and the company of cultivated men, and usually retired in good spirits. It was in the early morning that he felt the ache in his breast. It had something to do with waking in the early morning. It seemed to him that the gray dawn lasted so long here. The country was a long while in coming to life. The gardens and the fields were damp, heavy mists hung in the valley and obscured the mountains. Hours went by before the sun could disperse those vapors and warm and purify the villages. In New Mexico he always awoke a young man. Not until he rose and began to shave did he realize that he was growing older. His first consciousness was a sense of the light, dry wind blowing in through the curtains with the fragrance of hot sun and sagebrush and sweet clover, a wind that made one's body feel light and one's heart cry today, like a child's. Beautiful surroundings, the society of learned men, the charm of noble women, the graces of art, could not make up to him for the loss of those light-hearted mornings of the desert, for that wind that made one a boy again. He had noticed that this peculiar quality in the air of new countries vanished after they were tamed by men and made to bear harvests. Parts of Texas and Kansas that he had first known as open range had since been made into rich farming districts, and the air had quite lost that lightness, that dry, aromatic odor. The moisture of plowed land, the heaviness of labor in growing and grain-bearing, utterly destroyed it. One could breathe that only at the bright edges of the world, on the great grass plains or the sagebrush desert. That air would disappear from the whole earth in time, perhaps, but long after his day. He did not know just when it had become so necessary to him, but he had come back to die in exile for the sake of it. Something soft and wild and free, something that whispered to the ear on the pillow, lightened the heart, softly picked the lock, slid the bolts, and released the prisoned spirit of a man into the wind, into the blue and gold, into the morning.
Chapter 4.
Father Latour arranged an order for his last days. If routine was necessary to him in health, it was even more so in sickness. Early in the morning, Bernard would come with hot water, shaved him, and helped him to bathe. They had brought nothing in from the country with them but clothing and linen, and the silver toilet articles the Olivares had given the bishop so long ago. These 30 years he had washed his hands in that hammered basin. Morning prayers over, Magdalena came with his breakfast, and he sat in his easy-chair while she made his bed and arranged his room. Then he was ready to see visitors. The Archbishop came in for a few moments, when he was at home. The Mother Superior, the American doctor. Bernard read aloud to him the rest of the morning, St. Augustine, or sometimes the letters of Madame de Sévigné, or his favorite Pascal. Sometimes in the morning hours he dictated to his young disciple certain facts about the old missions in the diocese, facts which he had come upon by chance and feared would be forgotten. He wished he could do this systematically, but he had not the strength. Those truths and fancies relating to a bygone time would probably be lost. The old legends and customs and superstitions were already dying out. He wished now that long ago he had had the leisure to write them down, that he could have arrested their flight by throwing about them the light and elastic mesh of the French tongue. He had indeed for years directed the thoughts of young priests whom he had instructed to the fortitude and devotion of those first missionaries, the Spanish friars, declaring that his own life, when he first came to New Mexico, was one of ease and comfort compared with theirs. If he had used to be abroad for weeks together on short rations, sleeping in the open, unable to keep his body clean, at least he had the sense of being in a friendly world, where by every man's fireside a welcome awaited him. But the Spanish fathers who came up to Zuni then went north to the Navajo, west to the Hopi, east to the pueblos scattered between Albuquerque and Taos. They came into a hostile country, carrying little provisionment but their breviary and crucifix. When their mules were stolen by Indians, as often happened, they proceeded on foot, without a change of raiment, without food or water. A European could scarcely imagine such hardships. The old countries were worn to the shape of human life, made to an investiture, a sort of second body for man. There the wild herbs and the wild fruits and the forest fungi were edible. The streams were sweet water, and the trees afforded shade and shelter. But in the alkali deserts, the water holes were poisonous, and the vegetation offered nothing to a starving man. Everything was dry, prickly, sharp. Spanish bayonet, juniper, greasewood, cactus, the lizard, the rattlesnake, and man made cruel by a cruel life. Those early missionaries threw themselves naked upon the hard heart of a country that was calculated to try the endurance of giants. They thirsted in its deserts, starved among its rocks, climbed up and down its terrible canyons on stone-bruised feet, broke long fasts by unclean and repugnant food. Surely these endured hunger, thirst, cold, nakedness, of a kind beyond any conception St. Paul and his brethren could have had. Whatever the early Christians suffered, it all happened in that safe little Mediterranean world, amid the old manners, the old landmarks. If they endured martyrdom, they died among their brethren. Their relics were piously preserved. Their names lived in the mouths of holy men. Writing with his Auvergnats to the mission that had been the scenes of martyrdom, the bishop used to remind them that no man could know what triumphs of faith had happened there, where one white man met torture and death alone among so many infidels, or what visions and revelations God may have granted to soften that brutal end. When, as a young man, Father Latour first went down to Old Mexico to claim his see at the hands of the Bishop of Durango, he met on his journey priests from the missions of Sonora and Lower California, who related many stories of the blessed experiences of the early Franciscan missionaries. Their way through the wilderness had blossomed with little miracles, it seemed. At once, when the renowned Father Junipero Serra and his two companions were in danger of their lives from trying to cross a river at a treacherous point, a mysterious stranger appeared out of the rocks on the opposite shore, and calling to them in Spanish, told them to follow him to a point further up the stream where they were forded in safety. When they begged to know his name, he evaded them and disappeared. At another time they were traversing a great plain where they were famished for water and almost spent. A young horseman overtook them and gave them 3 ripe pomegranates, then galloped away. This fruit was not only quenching their thirst, but revived and strengthened them as much as the most nourishing food could have done, and they completed their journey like fresh men. One night in his travels through Durango, Father Latour was entertained at a great country estate where the resident chaplain happened to be a priest from one of the Western missions, and he told a story of this same Father Junipero, which had come down in his own monastery from the old times. Father Junipero, he said, with a single companion, had once arrived at his monastery on foot without provisions. The brothers had welcomed the two in astonishment, believing it impossible that men could have crossed such great a stretch of desert in this naked fashion. The superior questioned them as to whence they had come, and said the mission should not have allowed them to set off without a guide and without food. He marveled how they could have got through this alive. But Father Junipero replied that they had fared very well, and had been most agreeably entertained by a poor Mexican family on the way. At this, a muleteer who was bringing in wood for the brothers began to laugh, and said there was no house for 12 leagues, nor anyone at all living in the sandy waste through which they had come, and the brothers confirmed him in this. Then Father Junipero and his companion related fully their adventure. They had set out with bread and water for 1 day, but on the 2nd day they had been traveling since dawn across a cactus desert and begun to lose heart, when near sunset they espied in the distance 3 great cottonwood trees, very tall in the declining light. Toward these they hastened. As they approached the trees, which were large and green, and were shedding cotton freely, they observed an ass tied to a dead trunk, which stood up out of the sand. Looking about for the owner of the ass, they came upon a little Mexican house with an oven by the door and strings of red peppers hanging on the wall. When they called aloud, a venerable Mexican, clad in sheepskins, came out and greeted them kindly, asking them to stay the night. Going in with him, they observed that all was neat and comely, and the wife, a young beautiful woman of countenance, was stirring porridge by the fire. Her child, scarcely more than an infant, and with no garment but his little shirt, was on the floor beside her, playing with a pet lamb. They found these people gentle, pious, and well-spoken. The husband said they were shepherds. The priest sat at their table and shared their supper, and afterward read the evening prayers. They had wished to question the host about the country, and about his mode of life, and where he found pasture for his flock. But they were overcome by a great and sweet weariness, and taking each a sheepskin provided him, they lay down upon the floor and sank into deep sleep. When they awoke in the morning, they found all was before, and food set upon the table, but the family were absent, even the pet lamb, having gone, the father supposed, to care for their flock. When the brothers at the monastery heard this account, they were amazed, declaring that there were indeed 3 cottonwood trees growing together in the desert, a well-known landmark, but that if a settler had come, he must have done so very lately. So Father Junipero and Father Andrea, his companion, with some of the brothers and the scoffing muleteer, went back into the wilderness to prove the matter. The 3 tall trees they found, shedding their cotton, and the dead trunk to which the ass had been tied. But the ass was not there, nor any house, nor the oven by the door. Then the 2 fathers sank down upon their knees in that blessed spot and kissed the earth, for they perceived what family it was that had entertained them there. Father Junipero confessed to the brothers how from the moment he entered the house he had been strangely drawn to the child, and desired to take him in his arms, but that he kept to his mother. When the priest was reading the evening prayers, the child sat upon the floor against his mother's knee, with the lamb in his lap, and the father found it very hard to keep his eyes upon the breviary. After prayers, when he bade his host good night, he did indeed stoop over to the little boy in a blessing, and the child had lifted up his hand and with his tiny fingers made the cross upon Father Junipero's forehead. This story of Father Junipero's Holy Family made a strong impression upon the bishop when it was told to him by the fireside of that great hacienda where he was a guest for the night. He had such an affection for that story indeed that he allowed himself to repeat it on but 2 occasions, once to the nuns of Mother Philomene's convent in Riom, and once at a dinner given by Cardinal Mazzucci in Rome. There was always something charming in the idea of the greatness returning to simplicity, the queen making hay among the country girls, but how much more endearing was the belief that they, after so many centuries of history and glory, should return to play their first parts in the persons of a humble Mexican family, the lowliest of the lowly, the poorest of the poor, in a wilderness at the end of the world where the angels could scarcely find them. Next week on the program, Father Bob Keller returns to discuss the last things. I'm Matthew Handley. Lord willing, I will talk to you then.
Special thanks to our broadcast partners. The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley. Copyright 2025 M.H. Media Ventures, LLC. All rights reserved. For more, visit purplecatholic.com.